Sir Frank Whittle was a visionary British engineer who revolutionized aviation with his invention of the turbojet engine. Born in 1907, Whittle's fascination with flight and engineering led him to conceptualize the jet engine while still a young Royal Air Force officer. Despite initial skepticism and setbacks, he persevered, securing a patent for his groundbreaking design in the early 1930s. Whittle's invention, which employed a centrifugal turbine to produce thrust, marked a paradigm shift in aircraft propulsion. His tireless efforts culminated in the first working turbojet in history in April 1937, months ahead of his German counterpart, who is credited with the first turbojet-powered flight, which incorporated in part Whittle's invention. Whittle's engine also powered the first aircraft to fly on US soil, and later the formidable Soviet MiG-15 jet fighter, as the Russians cloned his engine sold to them by Rolls-Royce and the British government. This breakthrough paved the way for the jet age, transforming air travel and military aviation forever. These are Frank Whittle's long-lost interviews, recently digitized from 16mm film in Pinewood Studios. Listen to the history of the turbojet directly from the brilliant British inventor exclusively on our DroneScapes YouTube channel. Thank you for watching.
I was born on June the 1st, 1907 in Coventry. My parents were working class. My father was, at that time, a foreman in Alfred Herbert's machine tool manufacturers. And I lived there in Coventry for 9 years, went to an elementary school there from the age of 6 onwards. And then the family moved to Leamington Spa because my father bought a small, very small, engineering outfit called the Leamington Valve and Piston Ring Company. And I really did get my first engineering experiences there because I helped him sometimes for, I think it was about twopence an hour or something like that, making slots in valve stems.
Excellent. And you went to grammar school, but I think you had a limited application at school.
Oh, yes, I was very lazy with homework and got a series of raspberries for that. But at the end of term, I would often do quite well. For instance, I'd come top of maths, something like that. I never did win a prize at school.
That sounds to me as though you worked at what you liked working at and nothing else.
Yes, and one thing, of course, that the school didn't realise, the headmaster and teachers, they thought that I was lazy and so on. So I was. I just did not do my homework very often. But I did an awful lot of private study. I used to go down to the library in Leamington Spa and study all sorts of things which were not in the school curriculum. And that was where I first started to learn about gas turbines.
The gas turbines of history, what, from Parsons' day?
Well, no, the particular book that I found in the library, which interested me, was by Stoddler, Steam and Gas Turbines, it was called. And it went way back, discussed things like Hero's engine, which was, I'm told, about 94 or 95 AD. Some difference of opinion as to exactly when it was.
I see. Now, presumably you made a decision when you were 15, were you to apply for the RAF? Can you tell us what happened then?
Oh, yes, I was always attracted to flying from my earliest years almost. When I was 4, my favourite toy, and this was 1911, was a tin model of a Blériot. And the things I do remember rightly are aeroplanes flying. So my heroes were people like Captain Albert Ball and Major McCudden and so on, the VCs of the First World War. And I just wanted to fly. And also I thought that boys in the uniform of aircraft apprentices looked very good. So I decided I'd like to wear that uniform and applied to join as an apprentice. I passed the exam all right, and then I went for a physical at Halton, and I was turned down with poor physique, they called it, which burned me up because I considered myself to be an abnormally active child. And so I was sunk for the time being, but before I left the camp, a very kindly physical training sergeant, if you can imagine such a thing, took pity on me, and he gave me a diet to follow, and series of exercises, max holding exercises. I did all that for 6 months. I put on 3 inches on height and 3 inches on my chest. So I thought, well, I'll have another shot. And I wrote to the ministry, but they said, no, once you've been turned down, you've been turned down forever. And there seemed to be no hope. And I got other people to write in for me, my physics master and other people, but no, the answer was no. I thought, well, I go through the whole process again as I never had. It had never happened before, in the hope that the bureaucracy wouldn't pick it up. And I was lucky that time. I got through both the written exam again and the medical, and ended up at Cranwell in number 4 wing. I didn't like a life as an apprentice. Of course, I joined because I wanted to fly, and then there seemed no hope as an apprentice. But the one thing which brightened life was I became very interested in model aeroplanes, making them, joined the Model Aircraft Society, and became really the leading light in that one. So much so that the initials BWMAS, which stood for Boys Wing Model Aircraft Society, was, most people said that meant Boy Whittle's Model Aircraft Society, because we were known as Boy Whittle, Boy Smith, and so forth in those days. Then we became aircraft apprentices later.
Then it was, as an apprentice, what did you do? A lot of mechanical engineering as your father had done with you, or what?
Yes, we had courses in all branches of practical engineering. Well, workshop practice, turning. The worst part, the most hateful part, was fitting, basic fitting, filing away at say a block of cast iron, which is like glass, and sort of thing you had a hell of a job to make any impression on with a file.
Were you learning very much about aircraft structures at that time, though, or engine structures?
Yes, we had to do stress diagrams, and for stress purposes, and we had to know how to pull engines apart and put them together and so forth. Well, there was a lot of that sort of thing.
And presumably the time you spent with your father was useful to you.
Oh yes, I was already familiar with things like lathes and drilling machines and milling machines.
Was your father particularly inventive?
My father was a very inventive man, but unfortunately he just didn't have the education to back it up. But every week practically there was some new scheme. He wasn't very persistent, you may gather, and one week it would be a gear drive, a new gear drive for a car. Cars were very much in their infancy in those days. Or next week it would be perpetual motion, and I couldn't convince him that perpetual motion wouldn't work.
Life as an apprentice, was it the RAF discipline that you found irksome?
Oh, I didn't like the discipline at all, and I particularly disliked stamping away on the parade ground, because it did seem to me that it didn't help an awful lot to one's training in a service like the Royal Air Force. But I do realise now that that discipline is important.
How then did you become a cadet?
There were to be 5 cadets selected from number 4 wing at Cranwell, and I was number 6 in the passing out list. I hadn't been a leading boy, which was quite a handicap, because up to that time no boy who hadn't been a leading boy ever made the cadet college. But Wing Commander Barton, as he was then, my commanding officer, had seen this large model aeroplane that we'd made, a 10-foot-6 wing span job, and that and other things, I suppose, impressed him. So when the number 1 boy failed because of his eyesight, it made me eligible. So I was recommended. I went through the medical and so forth. There was another narrow escape I've since heard about, and that was that Lord Trenchard nearly stopped it, because I hadn't been a leading boy, and I hadn't made no kind of a name in sports, on which a lot of weight was put in those days. And he said to Barton, "Are you sure you're not making a mistake?" So according to Trenchard's biography. In that biography, it says that Barton said he thought that he'd got a mathematical genius. So Trenchard said, "All right, Barton, but if you've made a mistake, I'll never forgive you."
The RAF nearly went without the jet several times over.
Mhm.
That was excellent. So you come to be a cadet. Doing what at first, Sir Frank?
As cadets, we had a very full program, of which, from my point of view, and from the point of view of most of us, flying was by far the most important. We only had 2 or 3 flying periods a week, but that was the real highlight of the whole course. Otherwise, we covered service subjects like Air Force law, buzzing, that's Morse code, and well, everything connected, which are particular to a fighting service, and then humanistics. We had to read certain like Lamb's essays, and I had to write an essay on that, and there was humanistics, that particular branch, and then history, and included history, and quite a lot of workshop stuff, rigging aeroplanes, pulling engines apart and putting them together again.
But the great joy was flying, was it? Was your if you can just say that again, was your physique no limitation on actual cockpit drill?
I wasn't. My comparatively small physique, I should say, was rather useful in flying. There's no problem about physique, sitting in an aeroplane and flying it.
And what were the aircraft types? They were presumably wouldn't hover equivalent.
I learned to fly on the Avro 504K. That was a very ancient type of aeroplane, 1911 type, and it sort with a toothpick between the wheels, to prevent it tipping over on its nose, which in reality it helps it to tip it over on its nose, or even turn upside down.
Which you never did.
No, I didn't in the Avro 504K, but I later did in the 504N. I have to confess that I wrecked 2 or 3 aeroplanes. 3 at least, yeah.
But in forgivable circumstances.
Well, no. I was in trouble, for instance, the first one, shortly after I'd gone solo in the 504K, I got lost. And this was at Cranwell, and wanted to get back to Cranwell when the visibility had deteriorated very badly. I think it was down to about half a mile. And I thought I found myself over the hangars at Digby. And I thought that the hangars at Digby ran east and west. But they didn't. They ran north and south. So I was targeting Cranwell from the line of the hangars, you see. Now, the curious thing about this, I never thought of quoting it in my defence. Where the compass should have been, there were just 4 screw holes. I didn't have a compass. But I never thought of quoting that about it. What did happen was that I aimed 90 degrees in the wrong direction, realised that I was getting more and more lost, saw what I thought was a beautiful green field, and it was young corn with very soft soil. So when I landed, I pulled up very smartly, and the wheels sank in. And I tried to find out where I was, and only some farm yokels came up, and they couldn't really tell me. They said Cranwell was over there pointing, and or Sleaford was. They didn't know where Cranwell was. And anyway, in the end, I thought, well, I'm going to have another shot. So I got one of them to swing the prop, trained him what to do, contact, switch off. Then, when I got all set, he forgot all the drill. He said, "Be you ready to start us, sir?" All words to that effect. Anyway, I got going. And then when I opened up the engine, see, my wheels had sunk in so that I didn't move for a few seconds. Just the tail just lifted in the slipstream. I thought, well, if I can get moving a little bit, it'll begin to ride over the muck. And so that's what happened. I was watching the hedge getting nearer and nearer, rain all over the windscreen. I made it. So I sat back, and then to my horror, dead ahead was about the only tree for miles around. I couldn't miss it. I just flew straight into it.
Were you hurt?
No. The airplane wasn't much good.
But there was a court of inquiry, presumably.
No. I just got a rocket from my flight commander. It was the day, incidentally, of the cross-country run at Cranwell, which all cadets hated. And most of my fellow cadets thought I'd done it to get out of the cross-country run.
Splendid anecdote. I think we have to come to the fourth year thesis now.
Yeah.
So, could you just take me through that and say to me that didn't everyone had to write this thesis,
Yes.
and just tell the story in your own terms?
A lot of people keep asking me how the jet job started. So, and I tell them the fact, which is that as a fourth termer, I had to write a thesis. All cadets had to write a thesis, and I'd written 3 on parts 1, 2, and 3 of chemistry in the service of the RAF. But for my fourth term, I chose future developments in aircraft design, rather ambitious, and rather concentrated on the engine side. But the main thing in that thesis was that I arrived at what I now know was the well-known Breguet formula. I wasn't familiar with it at the time, connecting speed, range, engine efficiency, and so forth. And to me, that meant that if you wanted to go very fast and far, you would have to go very high, heights of 50,000 feet, that sort of thing, at heights where the piston engine obviously wouldn't work, and at speeds where the propeller wouldn't work. So I started to look for a new kind of power plant. Well, I was struggling with looking for a new kind of propulsion. I looked into the rockets, and my calculation showed that with a bit of luck you might get 10 minutes endurance, which isn't a lot of use for aeroplanes. So I then turned to gas turbines and driving a propeller. But of course the snag was I still had the propeller, which just is no good for very high speeds. The height doesn't bother it too much, but it just doesn't like the high speeds. Because you have the tip speed, which is pretty fast, say 800 feet a second, added to the forward speed vectorially, so that you end up with the tip going beyond the speed of sound. And under those circumstances, the shock waves and things that form greatly reduce the efficiency of the propeller. After considering other things, when I was in the 111th Squadron as a pilot officer flying Siskins, I considered a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, the scheme which Caproni Campini later tried out. And that, according to me, wasn't much good because it was just as heavy as a piston engine, if not heavier. And the fuel consumption was shocking, so I discarded that. And then thought, well, why not throw that piston engine away, up the compression ratio of the fan, and substitute a turbine for the piston engine? And there was the turbojet.
This was really the moment of discovery. Did it come to you out of the blue?
Well, it didn't come to me out of the blue for the simple reason that I've been trying to find it for 18 months. And but just the thought, get rid of the piston engine and substitute a turbine. You might say that came out of the blue. Whether I was having a bath or whatever at the time, I couldn't tell you. I forget.
But you did wonder afterwards, I think, like so many inventors, that why it had taken so long.
I did indeed. Well, I wondered, after the idea had come to me, I thought, oh, my goodness, why didn't I think of this before? And it seemed so obvious then.
So how was your Cranwell thesis received, Sir Frank?
My Cranwell thesis, when the professor marked it, he wrote on it, in effect, because he didn't really understand it, but he gave me 30 out of 30, which I thought was quite satisfactory. Dudley Williams, who became so very important in the development, is now Sir Ralph Dudley Williams. He was a first-termer with me at Cranwell. We were in the same hut, in fact, and I used to help him with his more technical studies, and we kept in touch. And when I was at Felixstowe as a float plane test pilot, he was there as a member of a flying boat squadron temporarily at Felixstowe, by which time I'd had the idea and had discussed it with various people. And at Felixstowe, incidentally, it was considered quite a joke amongst my brother officers Leonard Snaith, one of the pilots there, christened it Whittle's Flaming Touch Hole. So I'd frequently been greeted with the, how's the old flaming touch hole getting on? Of course, it wasn't getting on at all, because though I'd been helped to take out a patent by W.E.P. Johnson, another close colleague, it wasn't making any progress. But then Dudley Williams came into the story later on. He was invalided out. He wasn't well, and he was placed on the retired list. He joined up with another officer who had been invalided out after a bad crash, and the two of them approached me in 1935 after I'd made many unsuccessful attempts to get the thing exploited, and asked me whether I'd done anything about it. If not, he thought he might be able to raise some money.
Can I just take you back? I knew there was somebody with initials WE. Don't get me wrong. Can I just take you back to the fact that your CO became interested, referred you to the Air Ministry, and then you went to see first, I think it was Tweedy, wasn't it, who took you to Griffith?
Yes.
Could we go through that?
Yes. When at the end of 1929, when the idea came to me, I was at the Central Flying School at Wittering doing the flying instructors course. One of the instructors there was W.E.P. Johnson, who became a very good friend and colleague in later years, and he'd been trained as a patent agent. And he became very interested in my proposal. He thought it would work, and he helped me to draft a patent. But before that, he'd gone to Group Captain Baldwin, as he then was, the commandant of the CFS. He convinced him that I'd got something that would work, and Baldwin sent me to the Air Ministry to see a man named Tweedy, who then took me to see A.A. Griffith and another scientist, Air Ministry scientist, at the Kensington Laboratory. Well, I explained it, and Griffith pointed out an error in my calculations, and it was all rather depressing, you know. And then after that, I got a letter from the Air Ministry saying, in effect, that they weren't really interested and so forth.
Were you aware at that time that A.A. Griffith was working on a similar development?
I'd seen A.A. Griffith, I knew was interested in gas turbines because Tweedy had shown me a paper that Tweedy had written on the theory of design of compressors, axial flow compressors.
So you go to, I think it was South Kensington, yes?
I went to see Dr. Griffith and another scientist at South Kensington, explained the idea. It was very coolly received. Griffith seized on a mistake I'd made in my calculations. I don't know how it came about, because it was important, but I hadn't made it previously, but somehow or other I'd slipped. But fortunately, when I went back and took another look at the whole thing, I found I'd made another mistake too, which happily cancelled out the first one. Griffith was working, as I now know, on gas turbines, but I had no suggestion of it at the time, except that I was shown a paper that he'd written about compressor blade design, and that was the only suggestion I had, that he was working on it.
Of course, at this time, they were moving on now from that. At this time, there were fairly formidable objections to what you were trying to do. Can you summarise them?
The big difficulty I was having with the ministry, really, and when I say the ministry, I would like it clear that it's not the uniform side I'm talking about. I had a lot of help from the uniform side. It's the civilian, the technical civil engineering civil servants who gave me all the trouble. A report had been written in 1920 by a man named Stern about the possibilities of gas turbine, and he'd come to some rather extraordinary conclusions, in my opinion, that it would weigh about 10 pounds per horsepower. A gas turbine driving a propeller was what he was after. 10 pounds weight per horsepower, as against the then piston engine 2 pounds, per horsepower, and he said the fuel consumption would be about 1.5 pounds per horsepower hour. That's about 3 times at least what the piston engine could do. And so he condemned it right, left and centre. Other people had been trying to make gas turbines, and they'd run up against the fact that if they had an inefficient compressor, that required a lot more power than theoretically would be necessary. If they had an inefficient turbine driving that compressor, and that was very down on power, so that the net margin between the positive power of the turbine and the negative power of the compressor was so small, in fact, or it could be zero, so that it wouldn't even turn itself over.
So you were really dealing with very narrow margin?
Yes, according to the theories of the time, there was this fundamental difficulty with gas turbines: inefficient compressors, inefficient turbines, and the other big snag was materials which wouldn't stand temperatures of more than, say, about 500 degrees centigrade at high stress.
Whereas you required?
We required to be able to run at over 500 anyway, with stresses of the order of 14 or 15 tons a square inch at the blade root, which was too much. See, the material just wouldn't stand that. The materials then existing in 1929. But I knew, or felt pretty confident, that they would evolve in the normal course of development, and of course they did.
That was what led you to believe that you could lick the compressor combustion and turbine blade problems? From
the start, I was confident that the real answer lay in improving the efficiency of the compressor, and I thought I could do it. Very conceited I was. And that I could improve the efficiency of a turbine. And I did recognise that a very big factor in favour of a jet engine was that when you went up high, the air temperature was very low, very cold, and that benefited the compressor a lot. It meant that you could get much better conditions for the compressor. And being a jet engine, only part of the expansion took place in the turbine, so only part of it was subject to whatever inefficiency the turbine had. And the other thing is that in a normal turbine, the velocity coming out of it is wasted. In the case of the jet engine, that was completely used. So there were several factors in favour of a turbine operating at great height.
Nonetheless, you had to go back to your squadron somewhat disappointed, presumably.
I went back from the Air Ministry after it had been turned down, more or less, and then received an official letter saying that the Air Ministry was not interested. And but nevertheless, W.E.P. Johnson, having had experience as a patent agent, he helped me draft a patent. So I filed a patent in 1930, and the patent was granted in 1932.
Do you think age and inexperience also told against you at that time? You were not a qualified engineer, of course.
It didn't help that I hadn't then received an engineering degree. I just had the experience as an apprentice and experience as a cadet. I had had quite a lot of technical training, but I still had my engineering course and Cambridge course in the future.
Fine, and now we're going to come to that. That's excellent. So what happened next? You go to Henlow. How did Henlow arise? And then perhaps you can take us on to Cambridge in the same sequence.
Right. After I completed the flying instructor's course, I very nearly got posted to number 4 FTS, Abu Sweir in Egypt. That would have been a real nail in the coffin of the jet engine if that had happened. But Group Captain Baldwin again came to my help and had my posting changed. So I sent to number 2 FTS in Digby, where I did a year as a flying instructor. And during that year, W.E.P. Johnson and I made many efforts to get firms interested, with no luck.
Now, at this point in your career, you were expected by the RAF to specialise.
After 4 years, every general duties officer had to specialise. He was given a choice between engineering, radio, navigation, physical training, and so on. But I didn't get a choice, because having been pestering the Air Ministry with inventions, they just said to me, "You will be an engineer." So I was sent to the Officers' School of Engineering at Henlow, and after 18 months there, well, after the first year, I was put into the second year for lectures, so I really finished the course in 18 months, but made up 6 months in charge of the engine test benches, because they had decided, because of the excellent results I got, distinction in every subject except mechanical engineering, that they'd make an exception. The Air Member for Personnel was the angel responsible for that, and they decided that though they'd stopped sending officers to Cambridge, that I would go to become what they called an E-star, which meant an engineering officer with a university degree. So I went to Cambridge in September 34 to take the mechanical sciences tripos, and we're being already fairly qualified. We were allowed to do that in 2 years. My time at Henlow on engineering was quite effortless, you see, because I'd already had so much training at Cranwell, and as an apprentice and as a cadet. And incidentally, this is a point I like to stress, that I owe a great deal to the extensive training I received from the Royal Air Force.
You, during the time you were at Henlow and at Cambridge, did you have time to refine your ideas over the jet?
While I was at Henlow and Cambridge, of course, I was learning more and more about thermodynamics and aeronautics and so forth, and polishing my ideas on the jet engine, and convincing myself more and more that it was a good idea. Except at Cambridge, I began to have doubts. I thought, is it, when you learn more, you become more aware of the difficulties. But fortunately, I didn't allow them to daunt me at that time.
Although it took a visit, I think, from two colleagues, which you can tell me about now, it took a visit from two colleagues to really re-stir the whole thing.
Dudley Williams, an old colleague of mine, we had in fact been cadets together, we'd been together at Felixstowe, and then after being retired for ill health, he joined up with another officer, ex-RAF officer who'd been invalided out after a crash, and they approached me with the idea of forming a company and getting on with it, and they succeeded. They managed to find a firm of investment bankers called Falcon Partners, and all this was happening while I was still doing the tripos at Cambridge, and Falcon Partners agreed to put up some money, and eventually in March 1936 they formed the company called Power Jets Limited. When I was approached by Williams and Tinling to do something about it, I had got the feeling rather that I might be ahead of my time. With the extra knowledge I gained at Cambridge, I did become rather more aware of the difficulties. But nevertheless, my feeling was, well, if we try, something is bound to come out of it. And it was on that basis that I agreed to go ahead with them.
The critical time with your relationship with Falk must have come when you got when they commissioned, was it they who commissioned Bramson? Can we go through that?
Falcon Partners were approached by an intermediary, an engineer named Bramson. Williams and Tinling got in touch with him, and he got in touch with Falcon Partners, and Falcon Partners commissioned him to write a report on the whole project, which he did, and it was wholly favourable. Bramson's report, you might say, was another of the big key points in the whole story.
What was he? Can you tell me something about him? And his Christian name as well.
His full name, Bramson's full name was Mogens Louis Bramson. He was of Danish origin, but he was a naturalised British subject, and he'd been very much involved with aviation, skywriting and all that sort of thing. He was a qualified pilot, and he was a pretty skillful aeronautical engineer. So his opinion did count for something. And his report, which I think is a classic, was inspired Falcon Partners to go on with the job. And so a company called Powerjets Limited was formed with a capital of £20,000, of which £2,000 was put up. It was on £2,000 we started.
Fine. Did you know that M.L. Bramson's letter, which you say in your book you can't trace, is in fact in the Public Record Office together with his report? It's extant, yes. We'll send you a copy of that if we can dig it out. Will you remember that? No? Thanks. If you'd like a copy of it, I presume you would for your record.
Oh, yes, I
yes,
would.
good. Right. And also at that time, I think perhaps we should say about a word about Lance White, shouldn't we?
Mm-hmm. Falcon Partners was quite a small commercial banking firm, and the principal man who dealt with me was Lance White, who had been trained as a physicist. He was a physicist who became a banker. So to that extent, he knew quite a lot about the sort of thing I was talking about. And I've since heard he was rather impressed by my attitude an outlook on the job when I said to him, look, if you're going to raise money for this thing, do it on the basis that it's a 31 against chance.
30 to 1 against chance.
30 to 1.
Against chance. Good. Now, going on a little, the birth of Powerjets coincides with your taking your first, isn't it? Can you tell me about the circumstances of that?
Our dealings with Falcon Partners took place at the end of 1935 and the beginning of 1936, and I was due to take my tripos in May of 1936, and I was very much wanted first-class honours, so I had to work like hell because I was designing the jet engine and preparing for my finals at the same time, and that was a very difficult thing to do. I had to lay off, stop for about 4 weeks dead, and leave Bramson to do the technical, look after the technical side of things, while I got on with my tripos studies.
Nonetheless, you got a first.
I succeeded in getting my first, happily, and then was able to turn back to the jet engine. Though, of course, normally I would have been sent back to a squadron somewhere or a maintenance base. But happily, my tutor at Peterhouse was another convert, and he managed to persuade the Director of Education at the Air Ministry that to give me a chance to go on with the job, and he in turn persuaded Air Marshal Bogle again, Air Member of Personnel, and he agreed that I should stay on at Cambridge, nominally doing a postgraduate course. But a letter I had shows that they knew what was really behind it, because it said, this may mean you'll have to give an increased share of your to the ministry.
Sorry, this meant they had stipulated no more than 6 hours of work a week, hadn't they?
That's right, yes.
So can you tell me how that came about?
When Powerjets was formed, it was subject to what was known as a four-party agreement, in which the Air Ministry was a party. Williams, Tinding and I were joint as shareholders and so forth. And one of the stipulations in this agreement was that I would be allowed to spend 6 hours a week on the job.
How did it come to pass that was, as it were, ignored?
That 6 hours a week specification, as it were, was not other than a paper requirement, I don't think. I certainly ignored it, and no one pulled me up for doing so.
Okay. Right, Sir Frank. The Air Ministry stipulated 6 hours a week, but that got forgotten, I think.
When the four-party agreement was signed, of which the Air Ministry was a major party, the one clause said that I was not to work more than 6 hours a week on the job. But of course, that didn't operate as an effective control on me. I worked practically full time on it, apart from doing a certain amount of wind tunnel research for Melville Jones.
The stipulation presumably were there because they regarded you as a full-serving officer.
I don't know why they specified 6 hours a week. I was, of course, flight lieutenant on specialised in engineering. I now had what was called an E-star qualification, but there was no attempt to enforce the 6 hours.
One of the things I'm not clear about, and I don't think it's altogether clear in the book, is that you get your first, that's fine. The company is set up, that's fine. And then there's a period in which you suddenly materialise at British Thompson Houston. Can you tell me how all that came about?
Before, when Falcon Partners decided to form Power Jets with the initial £2,000, before the actual company was formed in March 1936, they placed an order with the British Thompson Houston Company, on my recommendation, for the drawings, just for drawings. And then after the company was formed, they placed a contract for the making of the engine. And at that time, all we had was £2,000 of the kitty.
Who is they?
The
people who placed the order were... Okay.
Falcon Partners placed the order before Power Jets was formed for drawings. And then after Power Jets was formed, Power Jets was enabled to follow up the order for drawings with an order for manufacture.
Power Jets at that time consisted of who?
Power Jets was nothing more than its board of directors. And that was Williams and Tinling, White, Bramson, Sir Maurice Bonham Carter, and I was attached as a nominal chief engineer.
And at that time, operationally, the company was you and what, a room in BTH?
Yes. I was the only effective member of the company, and cooperating with the BTH very closely. I was living at Cambridge initially and just travelling backwards and forwards, staying at the Grand Hotel in Rugby, so forth. And the BTH were pretty good in that they allowed me to use an office actually in the plant, as though I were almost a member of the company.
Or did you in fact build the engine yourself?
Oh no, the BTH built the engine, and I stood over it more or less while it was going on. I stood over the draftsman. I did some of the drawing myself, and the draftsman followed my instructions. And one of the requirements was that every drawing had to be initialed by me.
And at that time, were you feeling fairly confident in your approach to the first run?
I felt that we were going to be all right as far as the simple centrifugal compressor was concerned. I felt that the turbine was going to be all right, but I was uneasy about the combustion problem because we were aiming at 24 times the kind of combustion intensity that was obtainable in those days. So to try and deal with that situation, I went to the British Industries Fair at Birmingham, talked to Babcocks and Wilcox and this firm and that firm, and they all said, oh no, that's beyond possibility, until I tackled a firm called Laidlaw Drew & Company, a Scottish firm. And Laidlaw thought that he could deal with the situation. So he then, under contract from Power Jets, helped me to do combustion tests outside the BTH factory. And we thought we'd solve the problem, but it was another 3 years before we really did. We started to build the engine in 1936, and it was nearly ready for running in March. We had a little trouble there. We had to abandon our starter motor, which was a two-stroke, a post cylinder Sprite aero engine. Its torque fluctuations were too violent for the shaft, so we had to substitute a heavy electric motor, 20 kilowatt electric motor, for starting purposes. And this was mounted on a four-wheel truck, quite a small truck, complete with the engine. The whole outfit was just on this truck, which was hooked to the factory wall by a spring balance to measure the thrust, we hoped. But when we had to substitute the electric motor for the original starter motor, it was so heavy that it was too much for the tyres. We had to take the wheels off, so we never really got thrust measurements in those early days. But the engine became ready for running proper on April the 12th of 1937. A lot of people said it wouldn't even turn itself over. And I didn't really have that doubt myself, but anyway, what did happen proved the very opposite, because the starting sequence was this. I gave a signal to light up when I turned on a control for a small pilot jet in the combustion chamber. Then I got a signal, thumb up sign from a test fitter who was looking through a little quartz window into the combustion chamber to show that it had lit up. And I was on the main control. Then I gave a signal with my hands to raise the speed with the electric motor to 2,000 RPM, and that was done. And then I opened the main control, and it started all right. It went off out of control, accelerated out of control, and so did everyone standing around it. They all went down the factory like the wind. I didn't, because I was petrified with fright. I just couldn't move. And I screwed down the control immediately as the speed went whistling up, and the noise like an air raid siren and so forth. And it still went on accelerating after I'd shut off the control valve. It seemed like perpetual motion, but of course it wasn't. The fact was that a pool of fuel had accumulated in the combustion chamber, which we didn't know about, and that was keeping it running after I'd switched off the control. Well, that sort of thing happened day after day. We had about 4 of that kind of runaway.
Very good. What did you conceive that you were doing at that time? Accumulating data, refining the engine, both, or what was the sort of program that you had in mind?
We had built the engine, and because it was the only way of dealing with the job with the money we had. We thought, well, the proper scientific way to go about the job would be to build a compressor and test it, build a turbine and test it, build combustion chambers and test it, and then put them all together when the results from each were satisfactory. But the cost for that would have been about £30,000, and there was no hope of getting that amount of money. So the only thing to do was go ahead with the complete engine. In fact, what we were doing was trying to prove the engine right from the word go.
In fact, you were trying to prove the engine from the word go, but you were doing it through 37, 38, 39 against a constant background of financial shortage. There
were several things which hampered progress, and I think that in 1937-38, the worst was the tight financial situation. Our financial backers began to get cold feet. They had, quite unrealistically, expected that within a matter of a month or two, we would have an engine capable of flying in the stratosphere.
1937, 38, 39 are, however, punctuated by financial crises, aren't they?
We were running into all sorts of difficulties in 37 and 38, not the least of which was the financial problem. Because our financial backers were expecting miracles, I suppose. They thought we would have an aero engine within a matter of weeks. Well, of course, we had breakdown after breakdown, and they began to lose heart. And they did not produce the money that they promised. They had an option, you see, to produce a certain amount of money after a certain amount of time, and they obviously got cold feet. The result of that was that the control of the company passed into the hands of Williams, Tilling and myself. They didn't give us any money, but one of the conditions that we made for Falcon Partners to stay in the job was that they found a certain amount of money, and they did, in fact, put in another £3,000. And we were further helped by the fact that the BTH accepted 2,400 shares instead of £2,400 for a reconstruction of the engine.
Was the Air Ministry any more helpful over cash?
When we were in financial difficulty, the Air Ministry were very hesitant to help because we were in financial difficulty. There was a catch-22 situation going on. They said, this is a company backed by the city, Falcon Partners being a city company, who are just out to make money quick. And here they are running out of money. They don't have the courage to put money in. We're not going to risk our money. And so, as I say, you had a catch-22 situation. But they did, after he'd first run the engine and shown that it at least was self-driving, they did agree to a very limited contract, £200 an hour for running of the second edition for 10 hours. That would have been 10,000, 2,000 who had managed to complete it, £1,000 for a report on what had happened up to then, and so forth, a contract which totalled about £5,000. But there was another catch-22 situation came out of that, because as soon as they gave us the contract, we came under the Official Secrets Act and couldn't raise private money. Because you can't go to people and say, look, we've got a wonderful idea, put some money into it, we can't tell you what it is. So the acceptance of a contract from the ministry virtually stopped us from raising private money.
However, you had in, I think, Sir Henry Tizard, and I think also in Arthur Tedder, some fairly staunch friends during 37, 38, 39.
One of the big factors in our in the course of the development was that we enlisted the interest of Air Marshal Tedder and Sir Henry Tizard. Sir Henry at that time was chairman of the Aeronautical Research Council, and he, you might say, was a believer in gas turbines. And fortunately, too, he seemed to be a believer in me. He seemed to think that I knew what I was doing, and I think in the light of event, he was possibly right. And Tedder came up to see what we were doing and saw the engine run and was suitably impressed. And he became a convert and decided to back the project.
But at that time, the Director of Scientific Research and the DDSR from the Air Ministry, what was their attitude?
The Director of Scientific Research had been converted about a little earlier than Tedder and Tizard, because he was more intimately connected with it. But he'd been a sceptic, you know, up to about June 1939. He'd been giving us the money, what little he did give us, on the basis that it was long-term research. And he thought it would contribute to what was going on at Farnborough.
And, of course, at that point, was it 1937, 38? Can you just give me this back? At that time, you had from Farnborough, in the person of A.A. Griffith, a rather unsatisfactory report.
And when, just after the engine first ran, and we'd submitted a report to the Air Ministry, this was the subject of another report by Griffith, the man who turned the job down in the early days, and his report damned it with faint praise. He brought in all the difficulties, said that no propeller meant that we wouldn't have the slipstream to help us take off, and so forth. And his final conclusion was more or less that it might have some use if high performance were needed for a very short time. And that was the basic conclusion.
What do you think led him to that conclusion? What do you think led him to that conclusion?
I don't know why Griffith reached that conclusion, except that he seemed to ignore what we were trying to do. He talked as though the whole idea was to fly just where the Spitfire and other aeroplanes were flying, namely at heights up to, say, 20,000 feet and so forth. He didn't seem to register that we were aiming to fly at 40,000, 50,000 feet, well, even 60,000 feet.
Fine. I come now to Dr. David Pye, and June the 30th, I think, 1939, wasn't it? Can you tell me what happened on that day, the 30th of June?
On June the 30th of 1939, we managed to get a big breakthrough in the attitude of the Air Ministry, in that Pye, Director of Scientific Research, came up to see the engine run, and we managed to keep it going for about 20 minutes in his presence at 16,500 RPM, at which speed it pulled about 860 pounds of thrust, and he became a complete convert. So much so that he agreed that an engine for flight should be ordered, and that an aeroplane to use it should be ordered too.
Perhaps you could give me that little anecdote about driving him back to the station.
An odd thing was that he became such a convert that when I drove him back to the station to catch his train back to London, I had the curious experience of hearing him explain to me all the advantages of the engine, that it could run on any fuel, that it was vibrationless, etc., etc. And I just sat quietly. I was only a squadron leader at this time. I thought, yeah, you're telling me, old boy.
And in fact, this really was the moment for you, the moment of triumph, presumably.
This, of course, was the big turning point in the whole job.
The air ministry now take on the jet.
The air ministry did. From that point on, the air ministry began to assume control of the project, which I suppose, from some point of view, was rather a disaster.
I see. We'll come to the reason for that in a moment. As an example of the kind of trials and tribulations you meet in R&D, could you tell us a story about vortexes?
We made a number of technical innovations in the course of the jet engine development, and I think of them all, possibly the most noteworthy was a change we made in the procedure for the design of turbine blades. I went into a meeting in the BTH when they were discussing a change in the design of our blades. And someone remarked that as a consequence of this change, the end thrust on the bearing would be 1,800 pounds, which would have been too much for the bearing. But what puzzled me about that meeting was why should this change have made that difference in end thrust? So I went away and did some calculations and satisfied myself that the end thrust was very small indeed, and I couldn't understand the reason for the discrepancy. So I went to one of the engineers in the blade design office and said, "What is the difference of pressure between the roots and the tips of the blades?" And he said, "What difference in pressure?" And I said, "Well, the difference in pressure due to the effect that the fluid is whirling. There's a vortex effect. And the pressure at the outside must be quite a lot greater than the inside." "Oh," he said, "we don't bother about that. We assume the fluid is going straight." And I said, "No." I said, it might try to go straight for a fraction of a second, but it will soon pick up a whirl, and the blades have to be designed for that. Well, they didn't believe it at all until I was able to demonstrate that in fact was what happened. And I designed the blades after that.
As a consequence of which it was just with a 5-degree twist, was it?
Oh, more than that. No, it meant that, you see, they'd been designing the twist on the blades to conform with the difference of speed between the root and the tip. But what they needed to do was design for the difference of speed between the whirl on top of that. And it meant doubling the twist. So instead of just twisting to compensate for speed, I had to of the blade, I had to compensate for the speed of the gas too, and it did mean doubling the twist.
But in the end, you got a load on the bearings that was acceptable.
That meant that when the thing was designed according to the vortex theory, as we called it, the load on the bearings attracted nothing. In fact, it reversed slightly. It would be one way up to a certain speed, and then reverse in the other direction for higher speeds.
But in fact, you weren't altogether thanked for this. You weren't altogether thanked for this discovery.
This virtual revolution in turbine blade design didn't go down at all well. I became most unpopular, which is very strange. When you tell someone how to do a good job, and the consequence is that you become a kind of pariah, see, a little pipsqueak who comes in telling them that for 30 years they've been doing the wrong thing. Didn't go down too well.
There were some light-hearted moments though at Farjets, weren't there? I come to the cherry orchard. Can you tell us a bit about that?
We had quite a...
Start again, as you like.
Well, in the BTH, when we were doing the first run to the first engine, the chief engineer saw the engine run at over 13,000 RPM with patches of red heat on the casing and so forth. And he decided that we weren't to run at more than 12,500 in the factory. Well, it was no good to us to be limited to that speed, because the full speed, design full speed, was 17,750. So if we were going to run up to a speed which meant something, we'd have to find somewhere else. Well, eventually, after a lot of negotiation, they let us their old foundry at Lutterworth to work in for £200 a year, I think it was. And there we continued our testing. And being an old foundry, that in itself was a source of considerable trouble, you see, because when we were running, there would be a fine rain of sand coming out of the roof. Foundry sand. I forgot the point.
The point I was making was that despite these difficulties, it wasn't all grim, that in fact there were moments of humour, and the cherry orchard example was one of them.
Oh, yes. Well, in this old foundry, I had a little office up on the corner. It was a bit of a joke from the point of view of outside people, you see. And when we were concerned with the design of the engine for the E-28 and so forth, we acquired the name of the Cherry Orchard from the Gloucester Aircraft Company, who were building the aeroplane. And one day I asked them for their explanation. Why did they call us the Cherry Orchard? So James, his name was, said, oh, well, in the middle of a discussion, you get up and open the stove and shove Coke on it, and someone else comes, a small boy comes in with a cup of tea and so forth. And just as he finished saying that, one of my engineers, Leslie Cheshire, came through the door and held up a blotter and called out rocking blotters. What he was doing was announcing that he'd been trying to get rocking blotters for the people who worked there for some time, and at last he'd managed to get them. So that didn't do anything to remove our reputation as the Cherry Orchard.
It was a very free and easy atmosphere despite the sweat.
Yes.
Good. Going on now, the moment the Air Ministry decide to make the engine, I think they decide also to commission an airframe. Can you tell us about that now?
When the Ministry decided we got a good project, they wanted to give an order for an aeroplane and for the engine. Well, they gave us the job of getting on with the engine, and we subcontracted the building of it to the BTH. We wanted them to give us the order for the aeroplane too, so that we could subcontract and thereby control it. But they wouldn't have that. They gave the contract direct to Gloucester's. Well, that was fine, as it proved, because Gloucester's, under Carter, proved to be very efficient. So the arrangement was satisfactory in the end. And so we designed the W1 engine for flight, very similar to the original engine called the WU, but very much lighter. It was designed to produce a 1,240 pounds thrust, and the weight came out at about 620 pounds.
So the twist on the blade had to be what?
The consequence of having to allow both for the difference in speed between the root and the tip of the blade, and for the difference in speed of the whirling air entering the blades, it meant doubling the twists of the blades. Another consequence of this way of designing was that it made a tremendous difference to the end load on the bearing. In fact, the end load of 1,800 pounds they'd been talking about virtually vanished.
Simplicity, I think, was the keynote of the first engine, wasn't it? The simple centrifugal compressor. Perhaps you could explain that.
We aimed to have the simplest possible engine to start with. There were certain alternatives open to us, the centrifugal compressor or the axial flow compressor. The centrifugal compressor is a very simple thing. It's simply a kind of glorified rotor, the kind that you have, say, in a vacuum cleaner, and with the diffuser blades on the outside. So there's just that single set of blades for the compressor, instead of the axial flow, which has many, many rows of blades, each of them having, say, 50 blades. So it's a much more complicated device. I sat on the fence and I took out my first patent because I had a two-stage axial flow with the centrifugal stage as a third stage. But when I came down to designing the engine, it had to be simple. So I selected the single-stage compressor, centrifugal type, with a single-stage turbine on the same shaft.
But the airflow was curved, in fact, wasn't it?
Well, not originally. Well, there were three sets, really. You might say the first was curved in that we used a single sausage-shaped combustion chamber. Then we went to a rather complicated one, which I won't attempt to explain now. And from that we went to what came to be known as the reverse flow kind. The reason for that being that we wanted to be able to use the same rotor assembly, that's compressor and turbine, that we had all along. And we could only do that by using reverse flow combustion.
You didn't go along with A.A. Griffiths altogether in the aerodynamic blades design. How were your blades designed?
Griffiths had a theory that you should design the blades as aerofoils. Well, I did not agree with that then, and I do not agree with it now. He argued that you should design the blades. I say that you should design the channels between the blades.
Which meant what?
The difference being that, since you are steering fluid through channels, clearly it's the channels that are important. If you make an aerofoil and then bend it to give the right kind of angles you need in a turbine, then you get constriction and divergence which you don't want in a channel.
Fine. This may be the point, in fact. I'd like to go over it again. In this context, can you tell me something now about the vortex blading theory and how it came to be an issue?
I found out by more or less by chance that the turbine blades being designed by the BTH were based on a quite different concept of blade design than what I thought was proper. And I didn't realise this until, I'd left the blade design to them until I went to a meeting in the Deputy Chief Engineer's office, and where they were discussing a change in the blade design. And they were saying that one of the consequences of that change would be a change in the end thrust on the rotor. The load on the bearing, thrust bearing, would be 1,800 pounds instead of 150 or whatever it was. And I couldn't understand this. So I went away and thought about it. And then I went up to the blade design office and asked one of the engineers there, L.J. Cheshire, I said, what do you assume to be the pressure difference between the root of the blades and the tip of the blades after the fluid leaves the nozzles? And he said, what pressure difference? So to my astonishment, I found that they did not assume that the air coming out of the nozzles was whirling, but that each pair of nozzles was sending out straight jets, which of course is not what happens.
And then if the effect of this was that you altered the blade, is it pitch or?
This I pointed out that the fluid coming out of the nozzle ring would be a vortex, and the centrifugal pressure gradient meant there would be a corresponding difference in velocity. See, at the root, at the inside smaller diameter of a vortex, fluid is moving much faster than it is at the tips. You see that in water running out of a bathtub. And as the water moves nearer and nearer to the centre of the vortex, it spins faster and faster. Well, that's what happens in the flow out of a set of turbine nozzle rings. And to allow for that, it means that you have to put a good deal of extra twist on the blades. In fact, double the twist that the BTH were putting on.
And that settled the problem. Right, I come now to Power Jets itself, the company in 1939. How many employees did you have, and how many of them were fully trained engineers?
In 1939, we only had just a handful of about half a dozen then beginning of 1940 we began to build up a team, and I was very careful in picking real quality. First class honours Cambridge, first class honours Oxford, Imperial College of Science and so forth, Whittle scholars. I had quite a collection, and I think I can claim to have built up a brilliant team.
A young team?
A young team, yes, mainly. There were just, one was a little bit older than myself then, and then we added to that one of my former instructors. He became my deputy. He was quite a bit older than me. That was Wing Commander Lees.
And presumably for the young engineers, how were they recruited in terms of secrecy?
When we were recruiting young engineers, they came to this scruffy old foundry that we were now inhabiting, and were somewhat surprised, I think, when our managing director, as he had become, L.L. White, they went in this old ancient brick building up to rickety wooden stairs into an office with a beautiful carpet and a very nice desk and all that, which I suppose encouraged them not to turn tail and run. And then he and I would cross-examine them more or less.
Were they sent to you by the Ministry of Labour? Well, you couldn't advertise, obviously.
We were advertising, but of course we couldn't say what we were advertising for. And when we were interviewing them, we couldn't tell them what we wanted them for, although I think some of them guessed from the questions we asked.
Presumably their pay and conditions were very austere.
They were paid very little. They, sort of £3 or £4 a week, that sort of thing. I don't know what they were in fact paid. That wasn't my job.
We did cover this last Monday, but we'll have another go at it. And in fact, although the pay and conditions were fairly frugal, life was not all terribly real and earnest. There was a mildly light atmosphere. In fact, you came to be called the Cherry Orchard by somebody, didn't you?
The atmosphere at Powerjets was anything but serious, In fact, the Gloucester Company, when we began to work with them in connection with the E28 design, one of their engineers told us that we were known as the Cherry Orchard. And I asked him why that. He said, well, I didn't know what the Cherry Orchard by, is it Dostoevsky, was all about. But he said, people come onto the stage, say something at random, someone else comes onto the stage and says something else at random. Whether that's a true description or not, I didn't know. And just as he was saying that, Leslie Cheshire appears through my office door holding up a blotter and calls out rocking blotters to announce the fact that the management had at last managed to agree to spend a little money on rocking blotters.
Can you give me some idea of the costs, the Powerjet's total costs to 1939 compared with Germany?
Right from the start, we were working on a shoestring financially. £2,000 was the original sum subscribed, but dribs and drabs of money came in, £200 a friend of mine, £500 from a friend of someone else, and it built up slowly. And by 1939, we had spent, I don't know the actual figure, but I think it was about £7,000. In the balance sheet for July of 1939, the item to cost of unit was 4,000 and a few £100. So though we'd been going for over 2 years, we hadn't, that's all we'd spent on the engine. We were doing monthly bill, BTX were doing it on a cost plus basis, but fortunately for us, their overheads were only 150%.
The fact of the matter is, of course, that you were having to rebuild the engine out of old parts, and I think the official historian says that this really hampered progress quite considerably. We
were hampered repeatedly, not only by money difficulties, but by, they're associated with money difficulties. We couldn't afford to replace parts which had been damaged. In experimental work like this kind, damage is inevitable. We had impeller rubs, which damaged the casing so that the distortion caused joints to leak.
Now, you were hampered, in fact, were you not, by the difficulties over rebuilding the engines and using the same old materials over again?
In addition to our continuing financial problems, we had many others problems, including one string of engineering problems, like having to use the same parts over and over again when they ought to have been scrapped. And of course that was linked with the finance, because we couldn't afford new parts. We had to make do and furbish up damaged parts. And well, by the time we'd finished with the original engine, WU, in 1941, it was just a heap of scrap, really.
From 1939, 1940, the Ministry of Aircraft Production, Air Ministry, take over and finance the whole project. Does that mean a decisive leap forward in your affairs?
The Ministry began to give a little help in 1937, after they'd seen the engine run, but very limited help. You know, the total contract, bits and pieces amounting to about £5,000. Then they paid for a reconstruction of the engine. That cost £2,400. And but there, you see, there was another catch-22 situation, developed, because the as soon as we went on to the accepted contracts, we went on to the came under the Official Secrets Act, and that meant that we couldn't tell people what we wanted their money for. You can't go to someone and say, "Look, we've got a damn good idea. Would you let us have some money? We can't tell you what it is." But it's very good. No, we couldn't do it. And so we had to put up with what we could get from the Ministry. There was a little extra help in that the BTH accepted shares to the extent of £2,400 instead of payment. That helped.
In 1939, 1940, the Air Ministry and MAP, they assume full responsibility, don't they, and assume full financing. Did that mean a very rapid increase in the pace of the programme?
Well, when the Air Ministry began to control the project, more or less, from 1939 onwards, but that didn't mean that we got lots and lots of money. We didn't. It still came along in drips and drabs. You know, we would get a few £1,000s for plant, a few £1,000s for extra test house and so on. And it wasn't until 1942 that they really made a reasonable contribution in the way of paying for a new factory near Whetstone.
Fine. So you war, yes, but you don't exactly go into top gear. And this is where your association, not only with BTH, your association with the Rover Car Company begins. Can you tell me how that came about?
Our early association was all with the BTH at the beginning. They were our subcontractors, of course. We were responsible for the design, or I was, and but the work was being subcontracted to the BTH. Though we were building our own little workshop while this was going on, but we couldn't possibly cope with making all the parts for the engine, especially things like turbo blades and a lot of precision machinery. And so we, not being very happy with the conditions in the turbine factory, where there was no adequate precaution against dirt, dust, and the factory wasn't temperature controlled, and they were not used to doing things to within half a thousandth of an inch. We were looked around for an additional subcontractor and decided on the Rover Company. The reason being that we met Maurice Wilkes, the chief engineer of the Rover Company, because his wife had been a schoolgirl friend of the wife of Tinling, one of our directors.
And they were originally brought in purely and simply as another subcontractor, were they?
We intended that the Rover Company should be subcontractors and only subcontractors, but unfortunately they went behind our back to the Ministry and tried to get direct contracts, and eventually they succeeded in doing that. And instead of being subcontractors to us, they in effect became competitors who had the advantage of having all our information handed to them on the orders of the Ministry.
Well said. I'll just go back on one point. Not back, I don't mean that, but just in parallel, could you say that about this time, could you tell me something about this time about the Rolls-Royce company being drawn into the picture as well?
And I didn't really want Rover to be interfered to the extent that they attempted to do, of course, but I wanted Rolls-Royce, and I asked Sir Henry Tizard to bring Rolls-Royce into the job. And he said no, they wouldn't be interested. They're busy with their own project. This was a scheme by Dr. A. Griffith called the CR1.
Which in fact was extremely complex and didn't get anywhere.
The CR1 was a very complicated piece of machinery, and it was full of engineering flaws, and it just hadn't got a hope.
It's a little out of sequence, but let's turn now to the USA. How were they brought in on the project?
In 1941, of course, the international situation was very tricky. We were getting plenty of bombing, and there was obviously a pretty considerable risk that we'd be bombed out, or even have paratroopers dropping on the place. So, quite rightly, I think, the Sir Henry Tizard contacted the Americans with the idea of having production started in America as a backup to what was happening in England. As a result of his discussions and other negotiations that went on that I don't know too much about, we sent a set of drawings of the later engine, the W2B, the W1X engine, which we had first used in the E-28 just for taxiing trials, and a technical team, one engineer and two technicians, to the United States, where General Arnold, Hap Arnold, had selected the General Electric Company to do the job because of their experience with turbochargers for the right engines.
The Americans received the engine, in fact, from the hold of a Liberator, didn't they? What happened then?
We shipped over the engine in parts in the bomb bay of a Liberator, and also with the team, who were horribly frightened lest the pilot should pull the wrong lever and they'd all drop into the Atlantic. But anyway, they got there safely. That was on October the 1st of 41, and the Americans did a remarkable job then, General Electric. They had that engine, their engine, version of the W2B, called the Type I, on test in April of 42, so just rather less than 6 months, which is astonishing. And even better than that, 6 months later, the Bell Aircraft Company had their twin-engine jet flying before our twin-engine Meteor.
Is this a tribute to the Americans as development engineers or as production engineers?
This, their success in this field was based on their skill as development engineers. Of course, when they went into production, they made a good job of that too.
In fact, it's an oddity, really, considering the distances that have to be travelled in the States and the advantages of the jet. It's an oddity that the Americans themselves didn't think of a jet engine.
I don't know what the Americans had done before that, really, except for the General Electric's work on the turbocharger, which was, as a piece of mechanical engineering, was very similar to jet engineering, but of course it was just used in conjunction with the piston engine.
And didn't make the final step of putting a combustion chamber between the compressor and the turbine, presumably.
I've heard that the designer of that turbocharger was kicking himself later on.
It was not only in the USA that a decision was taken to disperse or diffuse information, wasn't it? In this country there was a body called, I think, the Gas Turbine Collaborative Committee.
The gas of 1941 was notable for another reason, as well as sending the engine to America, and of course the first flights of the aeroplane. It was also notable for the formation of the Gas Turbine Collaboration Committee, the purpose of which was to bring all the firms together and pool their information at regular meetings. And that was quite a successful setup, chaired by Dr. Harold Roxley Cox, as he was then, Director of Special Projects at the Ministry. He's now Lord Kings Norton.
The idea being to give the other aero engine manufacturers an entree into the jet business.
The whole object of the Gas Turbine Collaboration Committee was to amplify what was already going on before. See, we power jets had to supply all our drawings to Vauxhalls until they dropped out, to Havilland, Rover, but not Rolls-Royce, because they hadn't yet come into the picture to that extent. But the Gas Turbine Collaboration Committee was to coordinate all these efforts And it included people like this Joseph Lucas, who were subcontractors to Rover on combustion apparatus.
This must have made you feel, the whole team feel, pretty vulnerable, really, wasn't it?
All this, of course, is putting power jets into a weaker and weaker position from the commercial point of view. But then we had to swallow, because it was a wartime situation. And I and several other of my team were serving officers, and we had to put national considerations before commercial considerations. That was very dominant in my mind.
Although you would have liked to manufacture during the war, if possible, would you?
I always wanted to include manufacturing in our duties in power jets. That meant a considerable build-up, but at least I thought we should get what I call pilot production. That is a run of a sufficient number of engines to determine what the production processes should be. And we did in fact have a limited equipment for that job. For example, we built 40 W2-700 engines, but there was never any real hope that power jets would be given full production.
I'll come to the E-28 now. The plane itself was a very simple plane, wasn't it? Rather delightful, I gather.
The E-28 was designed by the Gloucester Aircraft Company. I had hoped that it would be a subcontract from power jets, but in fact it was a direct contract from the ministry. But that worked fine, because we had no problems with Gloucester. We got on very well with them, and they used our advice. We went along with them, and the RAE helped too. They did the wind tunnel test and so forth, and the building of the E-28 was a pretty smooth process.
I'll bring you to the taxiing trials now and ask you whether in fact you were able to participate at all, or whether you were standing on the sidelines at Gloucester watching.
Uh-huh. At the beginning of 1941, the airplane was ready, but we hadn't got an engine for it. They were just a bit ahead of us. And so we decided to let them have the W1X, which was a kind of lash-up. It was built of spares from the real flight engine, called the W1, and parts which had been scrapped. And we put this together and called it the W1X, meaning W1 experimental. And it did pretty well on the test bench. And we put that in the aeroplane in April of 1941 and did the taxiing trials, in which I took part. I taxied it myself up to just short of takeoff speed.
I believe initially that it wouldn't move on the wet grass, and there was a lot of apprehension among the crew then.
When Jerry Sayre, who was the test pilot, first started the taxiing trials on the evening of the 6th of April, he was rather depressed because we'd set his throttle stop at 12,500 RPM, I think it was, at which the thrust was very low. The grass was wet from rain and soggy, and he was going more or less uphill too, so he only did about 20 miles an hour, and he was quite depressed. He thought there wasn't a hope. But of course we knew that as you increase the engine speed, the thrust climbs very rapidly. And in fact, when I taxied it with the engine set for 16,000 RPM, it got up to 60 miles an hour without much trouble at all. And maybe if that hedge had not been approaching me so rapidly, I might have left the ground, but I would have been caught martial probably if I had done.
Good. In fact, Jerry Sayre did leave the ground, didn't he? He did a runway hop.
Jerry Sayre then did runs at 16,000 RPM and left the ground for 3 hops, I believe it was, of about 200 or 300 yards each, just a height of about 6 feet.
In fact, I think you say in your book that it was a thoroughly unairworthy engine, but it was quite safely managed. I think you said in your book that it was a quite unairworthy engine, but nonetheless it was a safe...
The W1X, of course, should not have flown at all. It was officially unairworthy.
I come now to the first flight, which is very significant indeed, obviously. You were on the day, I believe. You were in the office not expecting anything much to happen.
When we were ready for the first flight, we shipped Gloucester shipped the aeroplane up to Cranwell under covers, and I and some of my colleagues went to Cranwell to see the first flight. Well, the weather wasn't at all good, and it looked as though that was not going to work out at all. We'd been out the day before for some taxiing trials, and then on May the 15th, the weather looked as though it wasn't going to work out. So I went back to Lutterworth, and then we got a message to say that the weather was clearing, so I rushed back to Cranwell again, and in the evening Jerry Sayre did the flight. I was present. Jerry Sayre was sitting at the end of the runway, and party of us sitting just to the right, and he held it on the brakes and ran out the engine to full speed, released his brakes, and then he hopped off in about 600 yards. Quite an impressive takeoff. Then he held it down level and then climbed. Disappeared into the clouds then.
Quite a new sound in the sky, presumably.
It was a new sound in the sky, yes. Naturally, people in the area hadn't heard that particular kind of noise before, and you couldn't really hide it, however secret it was supposed to be.
And in fact, word got round that there was something mysterious going on, didn't it?
There were all sorts of stories started when the first flight occurred. One officer was said to have asked another one, "How does that thing work, John?" And John replied, "Oh, it's easy, old boy, it just sucks itself along like a hoover." Another story was that someone who claimed to have been an eyewitness said there was a Merlin engine inside the hollow fuselage with a little propeller. And he'd seen it. He was a reliable witness, he claimed. And so it went on. Another story was that it went up vertically, belching flame, which of course it didn't.
Sayre was very happy with the first flight, wasn't he? I think he took it around in a long curve. Or can you tell me anything about the statistics?
Jerry Sayre took the aeroplane up for about 70 minutes was the official time. And we didn't see him for much of the flight. We could hear him, of course. And then we saw him coming in, doing quite steep gliding turns, as though he'd been flying that aeroplane for months before. Obviously, he had complete confidence.
What was the feeling among the spectators on the ground, of whom you were one?
We, of course, were the small group of us that were there, no one of any importance. Really, and we were quite thrilled, of course, though I would have preferred it to have been the Meteor, which was then on the stocks, because that was a combat aeroplane, whereas the E-28 was just an experimental aeroplane. However, one of my colleagues, Pat Johnson, W.E.P. Johnson, slapped me on the back. He said, "Frank, it flies." And in the tension of the moment, I rather rudely said, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, isn't it?"
But the landing was perfect, no problems at all.
When the E-28 came in from the series of gliding turns, it made a perfect landing.
And I think that it was only a matter of days, very quickly, and I'd like to cover this quite in some detail, only a matter of days before it had worked up to a very high maximum speed, and that also you were able to do this without taking the covers off the engine at all.
After that first flight, there were a series of subsequent flights. I'm not quite sure how many, I think probably about 14 or 15 during the next 2 weeks, up to a total of 10 hours for which the engine had been cleared by the ministry. And quite a lot of useful work was done. The ministry had restricted the speed to 16,500, at which the thrust was 860 pounds, and at which thrust its top speed was of the order of 380 miles an hour. And rather less than that. But the ministry gave us permission to open up to 17,000 just for one flight. And at that engine speed, it did 375 or 380. Anyway, it was faster than the Spitfire. Subsequently, in those trials, it did better.
Did you hear a thing that I came across the other day, that at this stage Churchill ordered 1,000 Whittles immediately?
I didn't, in fact.
It's true, actually. He minuted the Ministry of Aircraft, the Minister of Aircraft Supply, and said, "Why don't we have 1,000 Whittles immediately?" Behind, however, the first flight and behind the huddle on the runway, there did lie something of a crisis, didn't there? Because by this time it was apparent that Rover were not really getting on with the job of producing a production engine.
While the E-28 trials were going on, the real job was being badly hampered. Rover was supposed to be designing for production of the W2B engine, which was the engine intended for the Meteor, while Gloucester was supposed to be producing the Meteor. Well, Gloucesters were getting on with the job fairly well, but Rovers were making an absolute nonsense of the engine. They just hadn't got the people who could do the job, and they thought they knew what to do, but well, an aeronautical engineer would understand what the position was, and I say they didn't even understand Bernoulli's theorem.
Right, fine, let's cover that. Now, what I'd like to do now is to get us really to where the engines are. You had a WU, we had a W2 and a W2B and an X. I get a bit confused by all this. Can you give me a description of what the basic engines in 1941 were and how they were coming along?
The first engine we call the WU. Then the W1X was a cross between the WU and the W1, the first flight engine. So the W1X was actually the second engine we built out of scrap and spares, and the W1 was the first real flight engine, very similar to the WU, but very much lighter in construction. But then we were designing for the Meteor fighter a more powerful engine, which we call the W2B, and that was the one that the Rovers were supposed to be putting into production.
Right. Now, perhaps you can tell us the main outline of the W2 for flying, the production engine, as it were.
The engine that was destined to be the power plant of the Meteor was a more powerful version of the experimental engine, really. There were no major difference. It looked quite similar from the outside. There were a lot of detailed differences, like the diffuser blades inside the compressor casing and so forth. The similarities were same kind of reverse flow combustion and the same basic turbine, but wider blades and fewer blades, that sort of thing, but really detailed changes.
What sort of thrust did you expect from it?
The W2B was designed for a thrust of 1,600 pounds, but it was a long time before we managed to get it.
And on the way, you had to overcome its surging problems, or attempt to overcome its surging problems. Tell me what surging is at the same time in your answer, please, Sir Frank.
One of the troubles we ran into quite unexpectedly on the engine which just preceded the W2B, which we call the W2, was surging. That is a temporary reverse flow in the compressor. If things are not quite in adjustment, if the turbine won't allow sufficient airflow through, then the compressor acts in an unstable fashion and you get a reverse flow. And it makes a considerable bang. It's very alarming. It was a case of trying to adjust, trying to match the turbine and the compressor. It was the failure to match that led to surging. As soon as one could get enough flow through the turbine to satisfy the compressor, then the surging problem disappeared.
Now, I get a bit lost in the narrative here because we suddenly come up with something called the B-26. Was that your design or somebody else's?
I haven't mentioned it.
So, no, I'm saying my own narrative in your book.
Oh,
we suddenly come up with. Is it something you don't want to deal with, or would you do?
Well, please yourself.
Yeah. Well, somewhere along the line in the chronology, we go from the W2B to the B-26. Yes, what was there?
One of the bits of dirty work, you might call it, is that the Rover Company and us and Powerjets were supposed to be cooperating completely. We were supposed to be giving them all the information, and they were supposed to be giving us all the information. And we even had one of their engineers resident with us so that he could see what we were doing, so that they couldn't possibly say that we were withholding anything. Yet while all this was going on, they, with the knowledge of the Director of Engine Development in the Ministry, were designing their own version of the engine called the B-26, which differed quite considerably from the W2B in the sense that it had straight-through combustion, which the de Havilland Company were doing anyway. De Havilland were the first to do it. There was nothing novel about straight-through combustion, but we had not gone to it because we knew from our experience of combustion that any major change in the combustion chamber would cost years and extra development.
Overall, at this time, were you aware that Whitehall itself was troubled by what it felt to be the anomalous position of power jets?
I don't know what the position was of the ministry with all the various undertakings they were trying to give to various people. They were telling power jets they would protect us. They were trying to get undertakings from the Rover Company, which the Rover Company refused to give. They were trying to get undertakings from the BTH Company, which they were refusing to give. So they were in a first-class difficulty, really.
And it was this, presumably, that prompted their move towards Rolls-Royce, was it?
Well, the situation became so bad that it looks as though there would be a complete hash of everything. The Rover were making such a poor job of the engine that the order for the production of the Meteor was cut right back. And then Sir Wilfrid Freeman at the ministry wanted to hand the whole job over to Rolls-Royce. I successfully resisted that. I think I did anyway. But nevertheless, Rolls-Royce did come into the picture in a big way, in that it was agreed that they would take over the job from the Rover Company and hand over to the Rover Company their tank engine, diesel engines they were making. And from the moment that Rolls-Royce took over, the picture changed completely.
How was the picture then at Clitheroe at Barn Elswick at that time? Did you know?
At the end of 1942, Rovers were just staggering along, getting 30 hours running out of, say, 6 engines. And as soon as my feeling is that they didn't want it to work because they wanted their B-26 to supersede the W2B. Anyway, when Rolls-Royce took over, within 1 month, the running time jumped more than tenfold to over 400 hours.
And one of the main agents, at any rate, one of them behind this was Sir Stanley Hooker. What was your relationship with him, or Dr. Hooker, he's then called?
The leading people in the Rolls-Royce team, which brought about this revolution, you might call it, was headed by Stanley Hooker, Dr. Hooker as he then was, and Stanley Hooker as he became later. He was a great leader. In 3 months, he and the team he had at Barn Elswick had the engine up to its full design performance, and in fact, shortly after, they improved on it. And the main reason they did that was they made a modification to the turbine, which I'd recommended 2 years earlier. That was just altering the angle of the turbine blades through 5 degrees, and that put the engine right, and it was able to go through its type test at full design performance.
Did you have... Sorry about that, I'll start that again. Did you have much to do at that time with the presiding genius, Ernest Hives at Rolls?
Ernest Hives was the chief executive of Rolls-Royce, and he was responsible for the Rolls-Royce part in taking over the jet development. Because he had come to realise that this was the future of the aero engine. And since Rolls-Royce then were one of the most prominent aero engine firms in the world, he wasn't going to be left out. He was I would call him an honest rogue, because when he was going to do the dirt, he told you he was in advance.
Did this happen to you?
And one of the things he said to me on one occasion was, he said, "We're going to be the centre of this job, and nothing you can do will stop us."
But in fact, your position at Power Jets was really, I mean, on a personal plane, was one of parity, really, wasn't it? You were quite happy to work alongside them, were you not?
we were quite happy to cooperate with Rolls because they were willing to take full advantage of our experience and not make changes for the sake of making changes. And that worked fine. We got along fine with Rolls-Royce, and things really speeded up then.
What was your position vis-a-vis Dr. Oxby Cox at this time? Was he part of the ministry or part of the GTCC or what?
Things had improved a lot in the ministry while this was going on, in that there had been changes of organisation. Certain of the civil servants who'd been, well, pains in the neck, you might say, had been relieved of the job, and Roxby Cox, Dr. Roxby Cox, as he then was, became Director of Special Projects and supervised the whole thing. And the civil service management of the job was much improved.
So in 1943 you were looking forward to the possibility of having Meteors flying, presumably?
By 1943, the Rolls-Royce having made such a big difference to the prospects of the engine, the ministry agreed to reinstate the production of the Meteor, and in fact they began to go into service in July and August of 1944 as a result of the changes in 1943.
Did you see some of the early flights of the Meteor?
The Meteor flew first with a de Havilland jet engine, the H1, later called the Goblin, in March the 5th, 1943. I was not present for that. I believe I was away at the Staff College or something.
You had at this time, I'll just come back to this, it's interesting, you had at this time quite a long stay in America too. How did you get on with your colleagues over there?
After the Americans had taken on the job, after about 6 months, after they actually had the engine running, it was agreed that I would go over and help them out. And so I went over at the end of May, but for various reasons it took me about 7 days to get there. That's quite a long story in itself. But I got there just at the beginning of June and helped them. I went to Lynn under an assumed name. They insisted I use an assumed name. I called myself Whiteley because I thought if it wasn't sufficiently near my real name, I wouldn't recognise it if I was being paged or things of that kind. There were times when I forgot it, like in the hotel I would waking up and sign for my early morning coffee and forget that I was supposed to be using an assumed name and of course sign the real one.
You must have been a bit of a nightmare to security one way or another.
I'm told that that didn't matter really because the waiter was an FBI man.
Were you impressed technically by the work at GE? Were they good?
It was most satisfying to see the work GE were doing because, well, they got on with the job so fast. It was remarkable. And their enthusiasm was most inspiring. And I thought at the time, if only I'd had that kind of cooperation a few years earlier, what a difference it would have made.
Their engine was not, presumably, their final engine that they made for the Bell aircraft was not that dissimilar from your W1, correct? Or not?
The GE's first engine, which they call the Type I, was virtually our W2B. The only real changes they made were to the auxiliaries, like things like the fuel pump and other auxiliaries.
Which tended to show to you, at any rate, and your colleagues, that you were on the right line.
The fact that GE were following our line so closely was very encouraging. To have engineers of that calibre not arguing with what we'd done was quite satisfying.
And now I've come to 1944 and the public announcement. From the years of secrecy and struggle, you suddenly find yourself and your team find yourselves heroes. What were the circumstances of this? Do you remember?
We had been working in complete secrecy until early January 1944, at which time, for reasons I don't really know, the British and American governments decided to make an announcement about it. Maybe it was to just to show that how good the Allies were getting along. So there was a joint announcement on January the 7th of 1944. It was like the world blew up around me. The shock was very considerable to have been working in such complete secrecy for so long, and then to be exposed to this blaze of publicity was no end of a shock.
It must have been a puzzlement to those who knew that at the very time that the public announcements are made and you become a celebrity, that abruptly the Ministry of Aircraft Production decided to nationalise power jets. Can you tell me a little about that, and can you tell me what you think their reason was?
Power jets was nationalised in 1944. It was partly my fault because I realised that there was a complete mess. From the contractual point of view, there were no effective agreements, and the government had spent all the money except for the shareholders of power jets. Power jets were the only people who'd risked their money. Rolls-Royce hadn't risked a penny, Rovers hadn't risked a penny, de Havillands hadn't risked a penny. No one except power jets had risked any money, except the government, of course. And the government by that time had put in, I suppose, 2 million or so, maybe more. And I felt that the government having put in 2 million, as against private money, power jets money of about 20,000, that it should be nationalised, with all the companies forming a collective gas turbine turbojet establishment, and of course I hoped that power jets would be at the top of the pyramid, with myself as chief engineer.
You go on to say in your book, in fact, that those who had founded an industry were deprived of the right to design and make experimental engines.
That was later.
Let me come back then to 1944. Now, the effect then of nationalisation was what? What were you doing? Put it this way, what were you designing and making at power jets after nationalisation?
In 1944, power jets had reached a point where they were able to produce, say, batches of 40 or 50 engines. We had that in the factory at Whetstone of about 80,000 square feet. And we were well equipped with test plant. And we had all a first-class nucleus for a proper manufacturing organisation. But there was such a mess that when I made the suggestion that everyone should be nationalised as my solution to that mess, Sir Stafford Cripps, the Minister of Aircraft Production at that time, used what I'd said to get the ministry out of the mess that they created by nationalising power jets only, which relieved them of all their undertakings.
In the sense, in what sense was that so? They had the right to use your patents freely, and they presumably then had the right to use your facilities for batch manufacture. Is that how they finished up?
The nationalisation of power jets meant that the government really took back all the plant which they'd provided, so it became government property properly, and took over all the staff, and they planned to carry on power jets as it had been, but then other firms began to create difficulties. They said they weren't going to have the government competing with private enterprise, so considerable pressure was brought to bear on the ministry.
I'm sorry, this was the aero engine manufacturers themselves saying, hey, we're going to be free and we're not going to compete with a nationalised concern.
Yes, the aero engine firms took up the position that this was manufacture was not a government job, and it certainly wouldn't be right in their eyes for a government firm to compete with them. So again, to cut that particular Gordian knot, power jets was combined with the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Pystock to become the National Gas Turbine Establishment.
Manufacturers may have felt some reticence about, or some reluctance rather, to see you manufacture, but at that time your program was fairly advanced, wasn't it?
At the time Powerjets was nationalised, we had some quite advanced projects going on. There was the LR1 turbofan, which would have been the first turbofan in the world. There was the engine for the Miles M52, the supersonic aeroplane. Those were our two big projects which we had in hand, and which were quite advanced by the time the National Gas Turbine Establishment was formed in 1946. But the consequence of the formation of the NGTE was that those advanced projects were cancelled. The Ministry said in the House of Lords, I believe, that the NGTE would be allowed to design and build engines, but the engine firms rose up in their might, and the Ministry caved in and removed the right to design and build engines from the terms of reference of the NGTE. And that was too much for myself and my leading team members, and most of us resigned.
Can you tell me what the advent of a turbofan, or more properly, what a turbofan was when you first had the idea, and what it would have meant in service, please?
From the earliest days of the turbojet engine, I was bothered by the fact that it has a basically low propulsive efficiency. The thermal efficiency can be quite good at heights, but the overall efficiency is the product of the thermal efficiency and the propulsive efficiency. And this kind of propulsive efficiency you could get was about 50% as compared with, say, a propeller at moderate speeds of 80%. So I wanted to better that. Well, the reason for the low efficiency is because the jet speed is so high in relation to the forward speed. There's a tremendous waste of energy. And so the answer to me was that we must gear down the jet in some way. And that led to the concept of the turbofan, for which I took out a patent in 1936. Now, the turbofan is basically similar to a jet, except that what would be the jet engine is used as a core engine to provide some jet thrust, but also to drive a fan, hot jet that is, but also to drive a fan which provides a large mass, comparatively slow speed jet, as well as in addition to the hot jet from the core engine.
And that increases propulsive efficiency, does it?
That reduces the average jet speed in proportion to forward speed, which has a big effect on propulsive efficiency. With a turbofan, you can expect propulsive efficiencies of 75% or even better if you have a very large bypass ratio. But a characteristic of the turbofan is that it gives a very large thrust for takeoff, static thrust, and then that falls off towards what you would get with the turbojet at very high speeds. At speeds of Mach 2, there would be no advantage in using a turbofan.
So its ideal use would have been commercial?
The turbofan would show good promise for dominating the civil air transport field.
In other words, in 1944-45, you were looking toward the jet engine as a means of commercial aircraft propulsion.
In 1945, we were thinking in terms of, both the long-range bomber and long-range civil transport. That was what the LR1 was intended for. And as a transatlantic plane, doing then, our target was 450 miles an hour across the Atlantic. And believe it or not, the minister said that people wouldn't want to fly at speeds more than about 250 miles an hour.
In 1945, you had your plans for the turbofan, which would have been a bomber and a civil aircraft engine. What was the officialdom's attitude towards that?
The turbofan was a very promising scheme, but unfortunately, for those days, with the pressure of wartime with us, it was rather too complicated, as we thought, for anything to be done about it during the war. But as the war progressed, in 1943, for example, I came to the conclusion that it could be the answer to a long-range bomber for the Pacific War. And so we went ahead with the design of the engine we call the LR-1, which meant long-range. LR stood for long range, and we also visualised it as an engine for a transatlantic aeroplane, civil aeroplane.
And in fact, at that time, the supersonic engine was cancelled as well. Presumably that was because the whole supersonic project was cancelled.
The engine for the supersonic plane, the M52, was an aft fan with afterburning, all tacked onto the back end of the W2700 jet engine, and that should have been given sufficient power for the Miles M52 to do 1,000 miles an hour. I think it would have done it, but the whole project was cancelled.
But up to that moment, we were presumably still ahead of the American industry.
The position in between 1945 and 1950 was that Britain was really ahead of the world in all forms of gas turbine development, but stupidly we allowed the lead to slip away.
And this is where I think, as you also write in your book, that the one consequence was that those who had founded an industry were deprived of the right to design and make even experimental engines.
When the National Gas Turbine Establishment was formed, at first it seemed as though we were going to continue with our projects, the LR1 and the power plant for the M52, but the opposition of the aero engine firms was so great, and the weakness of the ministry in the face of that opposition was such that it was ruled that the National Gas Turbine Establishment should not design and build engines. So we, the people who had pioneered the whole thing, were deprived of the right to design and build engines. Sorry.
Would it have been possible for you to go into the industry via the aero engine manufacturers? Were you asked by the manufacturers to join them?
When I resigned, I was invited to join Rolls-Royce, but I was still in the service and I didn't want to leave the service. So I became technical advisor to the Ministry of Supply, as it had become then, on gas turbine design. In reality, what I was mainly doing was lecture tours in America, Belgium and Holland and so forth.
Do you not feel, I certainly feel, that to deprive the inventor, the innovator, or put it this way, to deprive the country of the inventor and the innovator was a pretty silly thing to do?
Well, it's my opinion, of course, that when Powerjets was deprived of the right to design and build its engines, that is when I and my team, the people who had pioneered the thing, were not allowed to go on to build engines. It was a shocking waste of what we'd built up.
You still had a great deal of music in you. You could have done a lot more work.
The Powerjets team was still pretty strong and still the best in the country, in my opinion.
And when they dispersed, in fact, they too did not, like you, they did not go into the aero engine industry.
When the team broke up, it's a sad fact that very, very few of them indeed went into the aero engine business. A few stayed with the National Gas Turbine Establishment, but the leading people went to industry in various forms. And they've done good things there. For instance, Bob Fielden built up the Ruston Gas Turbine Division.
You are now, and we are coming to an end, we might have to go on to the next roll, but I'll do my best. You are now in your 80th year. You have changed the face of flight. On reflection, has it been a fairly sublime incident, the invention of the engine, or something that sometimes, at any rate, you might be prepared to forget?
I'm often asked how I feel about it, and it's a question I find very difficult to answer. But as things are now, of course, I can't say that I regret anything, really. Things could have been a lot better. we could have had a much bigger influence in the war than happened. But when I see what's happened in the way of civil aviation and military aviation too, but particularly civil aviation, the result, I can only say it's extremely satisfying, especially when you see something like the Concorde. And one of the things you see I never foresaw when I was working on this thing is that I would be a passenger crossing the Atlantic in 3.5 hours, as I have been on a number of occasions. And incidentally, another thing I didn't foresee is that I would have a son who would be flying 747s as a captain in Cathay Pacific.
In 1945, these were beyond even dreams.
In 1945, I could not have imagined these things. So in many ways, things have developed beyond my expectations, even though I was considered to be a crazy optimist.
But you did, in fact, undergo quite considerable suffering, mental suffering, illness. Is that, do you think, the common lot of inventors, or was it something that you personally suffered?
In many ways, I paid quite heavily for the work I did. There was the awful race against time. That dominated life. On top of all the technical difficulties, there were the financial difficulties, there was the skullduggery of people who were messing things up, and it was frustration after frustration, and it took its toll. I began to have a series of nervous breakdowns, and for years, it was years before I really recovered my health.
You would dearly have loved to manufacture, would you? That suggests to me that you were not so much a researcher as a doer. You didn't have the research temperament so much as the production temperament.
I wanted power jets to get into the production field, and I was indeed very interested in production problems. In fact, I think I can claim, or we at Power Jets could claim, that we solved a number of production problems, like the tertiary blade fixing for the turbines and certain things in the manufacture of the compressor. We did solve quite a few production problems, but on balance, I would have been happy to deal with the inventive side of production, because there is quite a bit of invention involved in production, not so much the routine of production itself.
In your case, you had the remarkable experience when you were in your very early 20s, at any rate, of ideas suddenly coming to you. Have you any idea how those ideas form, why it is that one person is gifted with them and another isn't?
I'm often asked how these ideas come, and it's not an easy question to answer. Sometimes they come out of the blue. Sometimes they're a result of seeking an answer, as in the case of the jet engine. Well, I think there's a lot of truth in the saying that necessity is the mother of invention.
The invention of the jet, would you regard that as a bolt from the blue, or a rather carefully thought out step-by-step process?
The invention of the jet was a very slow process, really, because I started looking for something as a result of an essay I wrote at Cranwell, in which I had worked out an equation which I later found out was the well-known Breguet equation. Well, that equation said to me that if you wanted to go both fast and far, you'd need to go very high. So I calculated rockets and decided they weren't much good. Gas turbines driving propellers, and they didn't look very promising because of the difficulty with a propeller at high speeds. And then I went on. I still kept looking for a power plant which would work at high speed, at great height, and thought of the scheme, a piston engine driving a fan inside a hollow fuselage, which Caproni Campini later tried out and found, as I found on paper, that it wasn't very promising. And then one day I thought, thinking about that scheme, I thought, well, why not throw away that piston engine and substitute a turbine? And that was the turbojet. And that was the end of 1939 by the time that particular penny dropped. But it meant it was really the end of an 18-month search.
But it was empiricism. It wasn't just a straight inspiration out of the blue.
it didn't come to me in a flash at all. It was up to the last bit saying, why don't I get rid of the piston engine? And
Fine. Just one question then about combustion, which I've forgotten to cover with you. Can you tell me what the real problems with combustion were and how they were solved? I think it was a man named Lubbock from Shell, wasn't it?
yes. The combustion problem was by far the worst one we had to tackle. It took us about 3 years really to get the answer. I think we missed it by a very narrow margin early on in our combustion test, but we did miss it, and the result was that we struggled and struggled. See, everything else, I was confident about the compressor, and I was confident about the turbine, perhaps too confident, but combustion, you see, we were asking for 24 times the best intensity of combustion in commercial work. And so it was quite a major problem. And though we did many combustion tests, and though we seemed to get the answer in the combustion test, it didn't work in the engine. But fortunately, a Shell engineer named Isaac Lubbock, who was head of their Fulham laboratory, was helping us with our fuel problems. And when he saw what we were trying to do, he went away quietly and did some work in his Fulham laboratory and came up with the answer of a burner which injected a fine spray in a swirling stream of air. And that was basically the answer to the problem.
What was it, the diffusion of the fuel successfully in the air, the right mixture?
Combustion is a very difficult thing, and I wouldn't attempt to describe what it is. But you see, you have to get these fine droplets. The finer the droplets, the quicker they'll burn. But the finer the droplet, the more reluctant it is to penetrate the air and get the oxygen it needs. So it's a difficult thing to balance the two requirements.
Fascinating, actually. I didn't realise it was that critical. And, oh yes, just one or two other things while I remember. I think now it might be an idea to say, OK, you had your frustrations, but that certain people, Tizard, Tedder, Roxby Cox, were persons of foresight who did help materially. Would it be appropriate to pay that tribute to them?
Yes, I think so. Well, you know, it was this way. Roxby Cox didn't realise what scoundrels the Rover people were. You know, he still doesn't. I spent last weekend with him. He still thinks Morris Wilks is a nice chap. No, I think you'd best leave that.
OK, so shall we say then that in your time you were certainly helped by men of vision such as Tizard and Tedder?
Yes, well, and Tedder, yes. But then, you see, Tizard was too helpful in that he wanted all these other people to get work on it, to have land and so that we had to compete with them for our materials. So we couldn't get... So
perhaps it's inappropriate. OK, as you say, fine. Yeah. I know that you see Concorde as the pinnacle of achievement. What do you see beyond Concorde?
Concorde is a marvellous aeroplane, and I've flown it many times, but I'm looking forward to the next generation of supersonic transports, which I think should be capable of carrying 300 passengers for distances of the order of 4,500 miles, like San Francisco, Tokyo, at speeds of about a Mach number of about 2.3. We're getting up to 2,000 miles an hour, as compared with the Concorde's 1,350. But beyond that, I think we're going to see even much higher speeds than that in due course. Unfortunately, they're going to be very expensive propositions.
Do you see that the next generation supersonic being a joint venture with the Americans, or do you think they'll try and do it on their own?
The next generation SST, I think, is going to have to be an international job. I foresee an international company, rather like exists now for the Airbus and things like that, financed by the governments of, say, America, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and based on some central point, that company to take care of the design and assembly, if you like, while the Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, Snecma, etc. are subcontractors on engine parts, and British Aerospace, Aerospatiale, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed, etc. are subcontractors on the airframe parts. And they also, I think, would probably be shareholders in the company too.
Do you see a role for hypersonics in the civil field, say from Mach 3-4 upwards?
In theory, it's possible, as has been proved by suborbital flights, to fly from any point in the world to any other point in about 40 minutes. In between doing that and the second generation SST that we've been talking about, there is the hypersonic plane, which I think is quite possible, and I foresee a combination of a turbojet to get it up to the speed of 3,000 miles an hour, a ramjet to get it up to speeds of, say, 6,000 miles an hour, which is ample for hypersonic flight. And then, if you want to get it to orbit from that, you need a rocket for the final stage.
What are we going to talk about this time?
Well, actually, I'm exhausted before I think you.
And we all might. We already discussed that.
Yeah, well, so we can't exploit the all-night anymore.
Nothing
We have
now.
that already.
I think everybody's been wondering who Doris is.
Cut it.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.